Tanse, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be presenting today on some research that I actually did for the Indigenous Connectivity Institute on the role of Indigenous mentorship. So the Indigenous Connectivity Institute is developing a workforce strategy to increase the number of Indigenous folks in like network, broadband, IT. And so me and my team were hired to look at what would a mentorship program to accompany this workforce strategy look like. So we've spent the last few months really diving deep into what is Indigenous mentorship, what are some wise practices, and what would a program look like that kind of works for the work that Indigenous Connectivity Institute does. The nice thing about this report, it should be published before the holidays. It will be a public report, so anything that we put in here, you can access at that time, and it will be on Indigenous Connectivity Institution's website. Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. I just did want to acknowledge that I'll get a little bit more into my introduction shortly, but really grateful to be on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin Nation. And yeah, really, really grateful to, I've spent some time on the water, and water as an Indigenous person, I grew up on a lake, is really important to me. So it's really nice to spend some time here. Yeah, like I mentioned, my name is Sarah. So I was born and raised in Elizabeth Métis Settlement, which is in northern Alberta. So there's 8 Métis settlements in Alberta, and I grew up in one, which I'm very grateful for. And my grandma was from Saddle Lake, so I've got Cree and Métis ancestry on my dad's side and mixed European ancestry on my mom's side. But I currently reside as a guest in Calgary. I'm the founder and managing director of Jackknife Consulting. Oh, sorry, I gotta use this. I'm founding and managing director of Jackknife Consulting. So we're an Indigenous consulting firm that specializes in Indigenous research, policy development, as well as organizational learning. And so we work with organizations across Canada to do things like research or design Indigenous policies for them. What we'll be learning about today is going over me and my team's kind of approach to this research project. So how we approached it, what the current state of mentorship is. We'll also be going over our findings from our research, and then we'll be talking briefly about our recommendations that we're putting forward for the Indigenous Connectivity Institute. So for this research project, what me and my team did is we did a mixed method approach. So we conducted virtual interviews with 4 women and 4 men that were recruited based on their experience with Indigenous mentorship programs. The majority were Indigenous. We had 1 non-Indigenous participant, but they had extensive experience working in reserves in Alberta designing mentorship programs. The majority of them were tech founders, CEOs, or ran Indigenous mentorship programs. And it was really important for us to have gender representation. So we're really grateful that we were able to get that. We still have 1 more interview that had to be rescheduled, but most of the interviews are complete. And then we also did an environmental scan. So we looked at mentorship programs broadly across Canada. And then we really focused as well on Indigenous mentorship programs that targeted youth. So we kind of did quite a deep dive into what's happening across the country. What are some like results that are coming up in themes? Me and my team also do all of our research through an Indigenous gender-based analysis lens. So really looking at what is the role of gender and sexuality and how do those intersect in findings that we have. So you'll hear that a lot throughout the research is some of the gaps that we were also identifying. So what is Indigenous mentorship? One of the things that we found is that, and many of us who are Indigenous probably know this, is that Indigenous people have been mentoring since time immemorial. The term mentorship isn't necessarily a term that maybe an Indigenous elder would use, or even Indigenous folks themselves, but they do kind of naturally do mentorship. Examples of this, so this was a quote from one of the elders that we interviewed for this project, where he talks about Indigenous mentorship being a family model of learning. And so if we think about, how Indigenous people would have went through like rites of passage or ceremony when they went from like a young person to adult, that is a form of mentorship. The other forms of Indigenous mentorship traditionally would be potentially someone showing an interest in a certain area and an elder, an older person mentoring them and sharing that knowledge. Mentorship within Indigenous context tends to be reciprocal, so one person isn't seen as more valued or the other. It's also community orientated, so a family or community coming together to support that young person over an extended period of time. So I really love this quote from the elder because I think it really touches on all those different pieces. So in terms of what mentorship programs are out there, so there's several different types of approaches to mentorship. The most common one, which we're all probably quite familiar with, is one-on-one mentorship, so where there's a mentor and a mentee. And this type of mentorship model is really great because it builds really deep relationships, and it can actually be particularly effective for girls. And it is really good at kind of having that really specialized knowledge transferred. One of the barriers of this is that it can be really intimidating for some participants to do this style of mentorship. And it can also require that you have the same amount of mentors for mentees, which can be a barrier if you're in rural areas or if you're looking for really specific knowledge. There might not be that many people who have that type of knowledge. The other one is group mentorship. So this type of mentorship is when there's multiple mentors and mentees who participate. It really encourages collaboration, peer learning. This type of mentorship works really well in rural communities where adult mentors might not be as common. And it also has research, there's a lot of research on the benefits of group mentoring as well, particularly for girls and women. However, the challenge with this type of mentorship program is it can kind of lack that intimacy that you might get or that catered knowledge with the one-on-one. And finally, there's peer-to-peer. So this is often when youth mentor someone else who's younger or like both at the same kind of level in their career. The benefits of this, it can feel an inclusive space. It can feel really welcoming. You can build a lot of supportive networks, but it's very limited in terms of, career advancement, learning something that maybe like if you wanted to like advance in your career or take a really specific direction, you might be limited in that. One of the most popular programs that we heard quite frequently throughout our research is called the Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program, and it's offered in over 50 Indigenous communities across Canada. And so they have a peer-to-peer network program where high school students mentor Indigenous youth, so elementary, and they often incorporate things like elders and traditional knowledge keepers. So that program has been running for a number of years and is quite successful. Finally, there's informal and then formal mentorship programs. So informal mentorship programs, we've probably all participated in that when maybe you start a new job and you start talking to someone and like, oh yeah, let's grab coffee. And then all of a sudden you're grabbing coffee, every few weeks to catch up. It tends to be more informal, less hierarchical, less structured. Research suggests Indigenous people tend to be more drawn towards these types of programs, where a formal mentorship program would have like a start date, an end date, structured programs, and there's really clear kind of outcomes attached to that. So through our research, we kind of found a few findings. One of the ones that came up was really the importance when you're designing an Indigenous mentorship program is really centering space for relationship building. So one of the things that I was actually really surprised was that all of our participants that we interviewed were former mentors or had mentored in a way, and they all talked about the importance of like telling Indigenous mentees, I'm not right for you, but this person is. And so that ability at the beginning for mentors and mentees to kind of pair up naturally based on what their interests are versus forcing a relationship that doesn't make sense. And so this makes sure that mentors and mentees are matched based on what their common goals are. And so ways that this was suggested was at the beginning, having time for a meal, something like this, like a conference, and allowing a relationship building to kind of happen organically. And so that kind of matching kind of happens from participants themselves, not you telling them who they need to go with. The second one that came up was around cultural integration. So all of the participants and research suggests that culture is really important in a mentorship program, but culture is nuanced. So it needs to be driven by community themselves. And so mentors and mentees need to decide what does culture look like for them in a program. So one of the participants that we interviewed runs mentorship programs in Alberta in reserves, and they mentioned that for communities, they decide what culture integration looks like. For some communities, that's spending a week on the land. For some communities, that's having elders involved in all of their mentorship. For other communities, it's doing a smudge and that's it. And so their whole philosophy is they lead and we follow. The final piece was program length. So a really strong recommendation was having mentorship programs that are longer versus short term. So the kind of best number was 6 months. Having programs shorter than that can actually cause more risk or harm to Indigenous youth in particular, because they might get really excited, they might start to form relationships, they might get out of their bubble, and then the program ends. And so making sure there's like continuity for the program, having some of that long-term touch points can be really helpful and beneficial. Finally, there was a lot of interesting discussion around the role of non-Indigenous mentors. So although it's ideally both the mentees and mentors are Indigenous, it was actually noted by a lot of the participants that a lot of Indigenous folks are over their tax. They are, they want to mentor, but maybe they just don't have capacity, or they're already mentoring so many people. And so I think that was a really big thing that came up, is that non-Indigenous mentors have an important role, but they need to be trained, and they need to make sure they have cultural sensitivity and are trauma informed. One participant talked about an example where an Indigenous woman was being mentored by a non-Indigenous man at the time, and he told her to do less storytelling in her work. And so that kind of, really goes against Indigenous ways of showing up in work, but perhaps that person just didn't know or didn't have that cultural understanding. So if there is going to be non-Indigenous mentors, making sure that there's training is a really key piece. And then finally, there's so many benefits of mentorship programs, both for the mentee and the mentor. So research suggests that Indigenous people who go through mentorship programs have increased like spiritual, mental, physical health. So it also can create more like cultural pride. The piece that I was also surprised to learn is that a lot of mentors talked about how it also helped them understand themselves better as an Indigenous person, being able to connect with other Indigenous folks from across Canada. They got to learn about different cultures. It also creates intergenerational learning. So, potentially having an older person learn from a younger person and vice versa. And it also has been proven to help with things like better outcomes when it comes to education, employment, and then more positive mental health. There's one program called the Outland Youth Employment Program, which is more focused on Indigenous youth, getting them into to jobs after high school. But the interesting thing about that program, I just was chatting with the lady who runs it, is that for a lot of youth who participate in the program, it's the first time. It's quite intense. It's their 6 weeks, and they're in a summer camp. But they're, eating meals 3 times a day. They're building community. They're in a really positive space. And so the impacts of that program actually kind of sets them up for life in a lot of ways. And many of the people who go in that program go into law, or they come back as mentors, which is really cool. There were a few gaps that I'll just kind of really quickly highlight. Some of the gaps include things like funding models was something that came up a lot. You really have to have long-term funding models for a mentorship program to be successful. The other one is your evaluation. So a lot of funders like to see, this outcome came from it, but a lot of the outcomes from mentorship programs are harder to evaluate, like increased sense of cultural resilience or, connection to community. And so making sure evaluations have those markers. The other thing that can be is making sure there's enough mentors for the program. If there's not interest from mentors and mentees, it's really going to stall the program and impact it. Finally, making sure that the program is trauma informed and really aware that you can be working with Indigenous folks who are vulnerable, particularly if there's youth involved. And then the access and participation barriers. So we're all here at a connectivity conversation. If the programming is virtual, it can create barriers in terms of people not being able to participate in online learning or online learning circles. If it's in person, particularly Indigenous youth can face barriers when it comes to like transportation. They might not be able to drive or attend meetings. And then as well, they might have other obligations like family obligations. So just being really mindful of like how accessible is the program? Does it meet the needs of the community? And then finally, just in terms of research, Indigenous mentorship is still in its infancy in kind of the research space. And there's very little research on Indigenous female experiences and even less on Two-Spirit mentoring. And then very little mentorship programs that exist in the broadband and networking space, so the IT space. So this conversation in itself, I think, is probably quite new in the mentorship world. With that, we kind of put forward just a number of kind of recommendations. So the first one is to really center Indigenous worldviews into any program, but really making sure it's based on what your mentees and mentors want. So not prescribing this is what it needs to look like, but really taking that time to understand like what does culture look like for your program. A participant had mentioned a quote which I thought was brilliant. They run an online mentorship program called the Indigenous Tech Program, and they said balancing inclusivity with practicality is key. And so, if you want to have incorporate culture, perhaps if you're online, like what does that look like and what's actually feasible? And then are you making sure you're practicing those protocols? The second one is prioritizing that long-term relational approach with space for ceremony and goal setting. So making sure Indigenous participants can self-select and potentially refer, even if that's halfway through the program or throughout the program, or even afterwards, being able to say, hey, I think this person should be mentored by this person or vice versa. Making sure that the program is accessible, trauma-informed, and address participants' needs. So this could be things like if the program is online and people don't have access to connectivity, is there other ways that they can communicate? Maybe some of it's like over the phone for a little bit or over emailing at first. Like I think there's just really being creative around what participants need. The other thing that came up quite a bit is having really clear policies and standards that are accessible. If you are working with Indigenous youth, like I mentioned, there can be a level of vulnerability there, or you might have mentors who've never mentored before. So having a really clear understanding of like what's okay and what's not is really important. And then making sure, particularly if the program is looking at Indigenous youth, which I know Phil and his team, that is an important component of it, is making sure you engage youth as partners. So whether that's creating an Indigenous youth advisory circle and having them say, help them like look at the program, design the program, and also evaluate the program can be really important. The Outland Youth Employment Program that I talked about actually has an opportunity for Indigenous youth who were part of that program to come back the second year as mentors. So then you're kind of creating that continuity of saying, hey, what worked for you? Can we change that? And so I think that part is really important, is having a youth who participated in the program being able to provide that really candid feedback. And then finally, this shouldn't come to any surprise as we talked about, but making sure you're really intentionally recruiting your mentors and then also providing them with support. I know I've participated in mentorship programs before, and sometimes I don't really know why I'm there, and there's a lot of assumptions that are kind of made. And so being really clear up front with what you're looking for your mentors, and then if they do need that additional training, that you're providing that and not just assuming that they're coming in with that knowledge, particularly if they're working again with youth, you're at risk of kind of creating a lot of harm if you don't do that. And then finally, we just created a very kind of small frame or short framework for Indigenous Connectivity to Institute, but really spending time to gather intel into determining, is this program going to be nationwide? Is it community specific? Are we focusing on a specific industry? Choosing the format. So is it virtual, hybrid, all those pieces? And then making sure you're determining what kind of mentorship program it is. Is it peer-to-peer? Is it one-on-one? What do you need to have for all those factors? And then looking at establishing a core project team. So this could include things like youth, elders, IT professionals. All those pieces can be really important. And then spend some time visiting with your community that you're planning on doing the mentorship with and seeing, is this actually going to be beneficial? Is this helpful? If we have a year-long mentorship program, is that too long for you? So really making sure you're spending time in that community engagement. And then finally, designing the program based on all of the touch points that you've gathered, and then implementing and revisiting. So I think that revisiting or an evaluation would be another term is really important. So you're constantly modifying it based on the feedback that you're getting. So in closing, this was kind of another quote that came from one of the participants where they talk about youth, and I would say Indigenous people broadly, but I think particularly youth, are really at an eager stage of their life where they want to learn, where they want to grow, and they kind of have those eyes wide open in terms of possibility. And so really having a key mentor can really change kind of the trajectory of their life and what career paths they take on. So mentorship has a really important role for them. But yeah, that's my presentation. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk to me about anything I covered, please let me know. And yeah, really excited to be part of this conversation. And like I said, the report should be public in the next month or two if you want to learn more. Thanks.